Once upon a time, in a small village called Imoni, there lived a kind man named Kofi and his beautiful wife, Amina. Kofi was known for his strength and wisdom, while Amina was loved for her caring heart. They had been married for many years and were blessed with 2 children, Sisi and Kwame. One day, a new woman came to the village. Her name was Zola. She was very beautiful, with long braids that sparkled in the sun. She spoke softly and wore colorful clothes that caught everyone's eye. Many people in the village admired her, and soon, Kofi did too. Over time, Kofi began to spend more time with Zola. He would visit her in the evenings, leaving Amina and the children at home. Amina noticed, but she did not complain at first. She thought Kofi was just being kind to the new villager. But as days turned into weeks, Kofi's visits to Zola became more frequent. One evening, he came home and told Amina something that broke her heart. "Amina," Kofi said, "I am leaving. I have fallen in love with Zola. I cannot stay here any longer." Amina could not believe her ears. She looked at her husband with tears in her eyes. "But what about our children, Kofi? What about our family?" Kofi simply shook his head, packed his things, and left. He moved to Zola's house, leaving Amina to care for Sisi and Kwame all by herself. The villagers whispered about Kofi's actions, and many were angry at him for abandoning his wife and children. Amina was hurt, but she remained strong for her children. She continued to care for them, working hard to make sure they were happy. But deep inside, she wondered if Kofi would ever regret his decision. One evening, something strange happened. Zola's house, where Kofi now lived, was suddenly filled with strange sounds. The villagers heard loud noises, like someone was crying or shouting. Then, the next day, Kofi returned to the village looking worried and scared. He went straight to Amina's house and knelt before her. "Amina," he said with a trembling voice, "I have made a terrible mistake. Something is happening, and I need your help." Amina looked at Kofi with surprise. She wasn't sure if she should trust him. After all, he had left her and the children without a second thought. But seeing how frightened he was, she decided to listen. "What's wrong, Kofi?" she asked softly, though her heart was still hurt. Kofi looked around nervously, as if afraid someone was watching. "Zola, she isn't who I thought she was. Strange things have been happening in her house. At night, I hear whispers, but when I check, no one is there. Last night, I saw her talking to someone, but I couldn't see who." The next moment, everything in the house began to shake. "I tried to leave, but the door wouldn't open. I think there is magic involved." Amina's eyes widened. She knew that in their village, some people believed in old magic, but she had never thought it could be real. "What do you want me to do, Kofi?" she asked, still unsure of how to feel about the situation. "I was wrong to leave you, Amina. I see that now. But I'm afraid that Zola has put a spell on me. I need your help to break it," Kofi said, his voice shaking. Amina stood there for a moment, thinking. She still loved Kofi deep down, but she had been strong while he was gone. "I will help you," she finally said, "but you must promise to be honest with me from now on, and never leave us again." Kofi nodded quickly. "I promise, Amina. I will never leave you again." Amina knew that she couldn't face this alone, so she went to visit the village elder, Mama Nia. Mama Nia was wise and knew many things about the old ways. If anyone could help, it would be her. When Amina arrived at Mama Nia's hut, she explained everything that Kofi had told her. Mama Nia listened carefully, nodding as Amina spoke. After a long silence, she finally said, "Zola is not an ordinary woman. She comes from a long line of witches who use their beauty to trick men. The whispers Kofi heard are the spirits she controls. But there is a way to break her hold on him. Amina listened closely as Mama Nia told her what needed to be done. It wouldn't be easy, but Amina was determined to save her husband and protect her family. You must go to Zola's house tonight, but you cannot go alone. Take something of Kofi's, something that connects him to his home and family. When you get there, you will need to call upon the spirits of your ancestors to break the spell. Amina thanked Mama Nia and rushed home to prepare. That night, she took Kofi's favorite blanket, the one he had slept with since he was a child. She held it tightly as she walked towards Zola's house, with Kofi following closely behind. When they arrived, the house was dark and cold. A strange wind blew through the air, and Amina could feel the power inside. She stood in front of the door, clutching the blanket, and began to whisper the words that Mama Nia had taught her. Suddenly, the ground trembled, and the door to Zola's house swung open on its own. Inside, Zola stood in the middle of the room, her eyes glowing a strange green color. "You should not have come here," she said in a voice that did not sound like her own. But Amina was not afraid. She held the blanket high and called out, "By the power of our ancestors, I break your spell. You will no longer have control over Kofi." At that moment, a bright light filled the room, and Zola let out a scream. The strange whispers stopped, and the room fell silent. Kofi felt a weight lift from his shoulders, and he knew the spell was broken. Zola fell to the ground, powerless, and the house grew quiet. Amina turned to Kofi, who had tears in his eyes. "Thank you, Amina," he whispered. But as they turned to leave, something even stranger began to happen. As Amina and Kofi turned to leave, the air in the room grew colder. The walls of Zola's house began to shake, and a deep rumbling sound filled the air. Suddenly, the floor beneath them started to crack, and a glowing light appeared from below. Amina grabbed Kofi's arm, her heart racing. From the crack in the floor, a shadowy figure began to rise. It had glowing red eyes and looked like a giant, dark spirit. The figure let out a low, growling voice that echoed in the room. "You have freed Kofi, but Zola's magic cannot be undone so easily. I have been awakened, and now, I will take what she promised me." Kofi, terrified, clutched Amina's hand. "What is that?" he gasped. Amina realized this was no ordinary magic. Zola had made a dangerous deal with a dark spirit, promising it something in return for power. Now that Kofi was freed, the spirit had come to claim its reward. But what could Zola have promised? Suddenly, Zola, still weak from losing her magic, crawled toward the spirit and cried out, "No. I didn't mean for this to happen. Please, leave me alone." But the spirit didn't listen. It reached out a large, shadowy hand toward Zola, its red eyes burning with anger. Amina knew she had to act fast. She remembered what Mama Nia had said about the power of their ancestors. She still had Kofi's blanket, the symbol of his connection to their family. Amina also remembered the stories her grandmother had told her when she was young, about how their ancestors could protect them in times of great danger. Without wasting any more time, Amina stepped forward and held up the blanket once more. "Spirits of our ancestors, protect us. We call upon you to stop this darkness." Suddenly, the room was filled with a warm, golden light. From the walls and ceiling, ghostly figures began to appear. They were the spirits of their ancestors, strong and wise, standing tall around Amina and Kofi. The dark spirit growled, trying to push past the bright light, but it could not. The power of the ancestors was too strong. Slowly, the dark figure began to fade, its red eyes dimming. With one final roar, it disappeared back into the crack in the floor, and the house became calm once again. Zola lay on the ground, exhausted and ashamed. Amina and Kofi stood in silence, amazed at what had just happened. The ancestors had saved them. Kofi turned to Amina, his eyes filled with gratitude and regret. Amina, you have saved me not once, but twice. I am so sorry for all the pain I caused you. I will never leave you again. From now on, I will be the husband and father I should have been. Amina smiled softly. We have been through much, Kofi, but it's not too late to make things right. Our family is what matters most. Together, they left Zola's house, feeling the warmth of their ancestors' protection around them. But as they walked back to their home, Amina couldn't shake a strange feeling. Something was still not right. The village seemed quieter than usual, and as they reached their house, they saw that the door was slightly open. A chill ran down Amina's spine. She turned to Kofi and whispered, "The children." Just as they stepped inside, a voice they didn't recognize called out from the darkness, "You thought it was over, but this is just the beginning." Amina's heart nearly stopped when she heard the eerie voice from inside the house. She immediately rushed toward the children's room with Kofi close behind. But before they could reach the door, a tall, shadowy figure stepped into their path. It was not like the dark spirit they had faced at Zola's house. This one was different. It had no face, just a black, swirling mist where a face should be, and its presence filled the room with cold fear. "Who are you?" Amina demanded, her voice shaking but strong. The figure didn't respond at first. It seemed to hover, its form shifting as if made of smoke. Then, in a slow, hollow voice, it said, "I am the keeper of the promise." Zola's deal was not just for her power but for something much more precious. "And now, I have come to claim it." Amina and Kofi exchanged a horrified glance. "What do you mean? What does Zola owe you?" Kofi asked, stepping in front of Amina to protect her. The shadow moved closer, its dark form looming over them. "She promised me a life," it whispered. "Not hers, but the life of one of your children." Amina gasped, her blood running cold. She could hardly believe what she was hearing. Zola had made a deal that put their children in danger. "You will not touch our children," Kofi shouted, his voice filled with anger and fear. "They have nothing to do with Zola's promise. Leave our family alone." But the keeper of the promise only laughed, a deep, bone-chilling sound. "A promise is a promise. Zola's magic may be broken, but the debt remains. And I always collect." Amina's mind raced. She had to think of a way to protect Sisi and Kwame. She still had Kofi's blanket, the one that had helped her call on the ancestors before. But would it work again? And would it be enough to stop this powerful being? Desperate, Amina held up the blanket and cried out, "Ancestors, hear me. Protect our children from this evil. Shield them from harm." The room began to glow with a faint golden light, but this time, it was weaker. The keeper of the promise only seemed amused. "Your ancestors' power is strong, but not strong enough to stop me. I am bound to this world by the broken promise. I will not leave until it is fulfilled." Amina realized that the magic of the ancestors alone wouldn't be enough. She needed something more. But what? Then, a thought struck her. If Zola's promise was the problem, maybe Zola herself could be the solution. She had caused this mess, and maybe she could undo it. "Kofi," Amina whispered urgently, "we need to find Zola. She's the only one who can stop this." Kofi nodded, understanding her plan. Without wasting a second, they rushed out of the house, leaving the shadowy figure behind, its laughter echoing in the night. They ran through the village, heading back to Zola's house, hoping that she was still there. When they arrived, they found Zola sitting on the ground outside her house, looking pale and weak. She glanced up at them with tired eyes. "I know why you've come," Zola said softly, her voice full of regret. The keeper of the promise has awakened. I thought I could control it, but I was wrong. You must help us, Amina pleaded. You made this deal. You need to undo it before it takes our children. Zola nodded slowly, tears filling her eyes. I didn't want this. I was desperate for power, for beauty, for everything, but I didn't know it would come at such a terrible cost. I will do whatever it takes to make this right. Together, they returned to Amina and Kofi's house, where the shadowy figure still waited. The keeper of the promise turned its faceless gaze toward Zola as she approached. You have returned, it said in its cold voice. Are you ready to pay the price? Zola took a deep breath and stepped forward. I will pay the price, but not with the life of an innocent child. Take my life instead. Amina and Kofi stared in shock. Zola was willing to sacrifice herself to save their children. The keeper of the promise paused, as if considering her offer. The air around them grew still, and for a moment, the only sound was the soft wind rustling the leaves. Finally, the shadowy figure spoke. A life for a life. The deal is accepted. As Zola stood there, a faint light surrounded her. She closed her eyes, tears streaming down her face, but there was also a sense of peace in her expression. Slowly, the shadowy figure began to fade, and with it, Zola's life force seemed to drain away. In one last whisper, Zola looked at Amina and Kofi. Take care of your family, she said softly, and then, she was gone. The shadow vanished, leaving only silence behind. The keeper of the promise had been satisfied, and Zola had sacrificed herself to save the children. Amina and Kofi stood in the quiet house, holding each other tightly, grateful that their family was safe. But they knew that the cost had been great, and Zola's sacrifice would never be forgotten. Amina and Kofi stood in the doorway of their home, the weight of everything that had happened pressing down on them. The village was quiet, and for the first time in days, there was no fear, no dark magic, no shadows lurking in the corners. Their children, Sisi and Kwame, slept peacefully in their beds, unaware of the danger that had nearly taken them away. Kofi, still holding Amina's hand, looked down at her with deep sorrow and guilt. I will never forgive myself for what I did to you, to our family, he said softly. If it wasn't for you, Amina, we would have lost everything. Amina, though still hurt by Kofi's betrayal, squeezed his hand gently. We have both made mistakes, Kofi. But what matters now is that we have each other, and our children are safe. Zola's sacrifice will not be in vain. The days that followed were filled with a strange sense of peace. The villagers whispered about what had happened, and many wondered if Zola had truly been evil, or just a woman who had been led down a dark path by her desire for power. Though she had made terrible choices, in the end, she had given her life to save the innocent. Weeks passed, and one evening, as the family sat around the fire, Amina noticed something strange. On the mantel above the fire, where they kept a small shrine to honor their ancestors, a new figure had appeared, a soft, glowing light, in the shape of Zola. It wasn't frightening or cold like before, it was warm and peaceful, watching over them with a gentle smile. Kofi and Amina exchanged a glance, and they both understood. Zola's spirit had found peace, and now she would be remembered not for the harm she had caused, but for the good she had done in the end. The children, curious about the new light, asked, "Who is that, Mama?" Amina smiled softly and replied, "That is someone who made a great mistake but, in the end, did something very brave to protect us all. She is part of our story now, and we will never forget her." As the fire crackled and the stars twinkled above, the village of Imani returned to its peaceful life, and Amina and Kofi learned to forgive each other and rebuild their family. They knew that as long as they had love and strength, no magic or darkness could ever tear them apart again. And so, the tale of Zola, Amina, and Kofi became a story told for generations, a story of love, forgiveness, and the power of sacrifice.